There's a fundamental misunderstanding about what an empath's light actually is. People tend to think of it as kindness, warmth, or emotional sensitivity, and while those are part of it, they're only the surface. At its core, an empath's light is awareness. It's perception. It's the ability to see what is there without distortion, without denial, and without the layers of self-deception most people rely on to stay comfortable. And that's where the tension begins. Because when you carry that level of awareness, you don't just see beauty, you see contradiction. You see when someone says one thing but feels another. You notice the subtle shifts in tone, the hesitation in their words, the emotional undercurrents they're trying to suppress. You pick up on what's unresolved, what's hidden, what's avoided, and the important part is this: you don't have to point it out. You don't have to confront it. Your mere presence is enough. That's what people react to. Most individuals spend a significant portion of their lives managing internal discomfort by avoiding it. They build identities around who they think they are, not who they actually are. They create narratives that protect their ego, justify their behavior, and keep deeper insecurities buried. This isn't necessarily malicious, that's human. It's a psychological defense mechanism. But it comes at a cost. It requires constant maintenance, constant denial, and constant reinforcement. Now introduce an empath into that environment. An empath doesn't play by those rules, not because they're trying to disrupt anything, but because they can't unsee what they see. Their awareness cuts through pretense. Their presence disrupts illusion, not aggressively, not intentionally, but inevitably. And when someone who is deeply invested in their own self-image comes into contact with that kind of clarity, something uncomfortable happens. They feel exposed. Not exposed in a literal sense where secrets are revealed out loud, but internally. Exposed. It's the feeling that someone sees more than you're showing, that they understand something about you that you haven't fully admitted to yourself. And for many people, that feeling is deeply unsettling. Now here's where it becomes psychologically interesting. Most people don't respond to that discomfort by becoming curious. They don't say, "Why do I feel seen right now?" Or "What part of myself am I avoiding?" Instead, they externalize it. They look for a source outside of themselves to blame for the discomfort. And the easiest target is the empath. So what begins as silent recognition turns into subtle resistance. Maybe it shows up as dismissiveness. Maybe it's passive-aggressive comments. Maybe it's a sudden shift in attitude that feels disproportionate to anything you've actually done. From the empath's perspective, it can feel confusing because there was no conflict, no confrontation, no obvious trigger. But the trigger was never external. It was internal. Your presence challenged something they weren't ready to face. And this is where resentment starts to take shape, not as a loud, obvious emotion, but as something quieter and more insidious. It builds beneath the surface. It's masked as indifference, sarcasm, or even forced politeness. But underneath it is a very specific psychological dynamic. You represent a level of honesty they're not living in alignment with. And people don't resent what they don't notice. They resent what reminds them. What makes this even more complex is that empaths often try to compensate for this tension. They sense the discomfort, even if they don't fully understand it, and they try to soften their presence. They become more agreeable, more accommodating, more careful with their words. They dim their awareness in an attempt to make others feel safe. But that doesn't solve the problem. Because the issue was never what you said or did, it was what you represent. You can't negotiate with someone's internal conflict. You can't manage their discomfort for them. And the more you try to shrink yourself to avoid triggering it, the more you reinforce a dynamic where your clarity becomes something you feel responsible for hiding. That's not sustainable. At a deeper level, what's happening here is philosophical as much as it is psychological. Your light isn't just about being emotionally attuned, it's about being aligned with truth. And truth has a unique property. It doesn't require force to be disruptive. It simply exists, and in doing so, it challenges anything that isn't aligned with it. So when someone reacts negatively to your presence, it's not always a reflection of something you've done wrong. Often, it's a reflection of something they're not ready to see clearly. And this is the critical shift in understanding. Their resentment is not a rejection of your value, it's a reaction to their own dissonance. Once you recognize that, your role changes. You stop trying to fix the reaction, and you start understanding the pattern. You stop internalizing their discomfort, and you start observing it with clarity. You realize that being seen as too much, too intense, or too aware is often just another way of describing a level of perception that challenges the status quo. And not everyone is ready for that. The goal, then, is not to reduce your awareness or dilute your presence. It's to understand the responsibility that comes with it, to know when to engage, when to step back, and when to accept that not every environment or every person is capable of meeting you at that level. Because light doesn't just illuminate what's beautiful, it reveals what's hidden. And not everyone resents the light because of what it is. Some resent it because of what it shows. If you look closely at the pattern, you'll notice that empaths don't just attract connection, they attract need. And there's a difference between the two that most people don't recognize until it's too late. Connection is mutual. It is grounded in respect, reciprocity, and awareness. Need, on the other hand, is one-directional. It seeks relief, validation, and emotional supply. And empaths, by their very nature, become highly visible to those operating from that place of need. This isn't accidental. It's structural. Empaths tend to listen more than they speak. They observe more than they interrupt. They validate more than they challenge, at least in the early stages. These traits signal psychological safety. To a well-adjusted person, that safety feels like trust. But to someone who is emotionally underdeveloped or internally unstable, that same safety feels like access. And access is where the dynamic begins to shift. Because when someone discovers that they can be understood without having to fully understand themselves, they start to lean on that external source. They begin to offload. They bring their confusion, their frustration, their unresolved emotions, and the empath almost instinctively receives it, not out of obligation, but out of wiring. There's a natural inclination to help make sense of things, to bring clarity, to reduce emotional chaos. At first, this can feel meaningful. It feels like purpose. It feels like you're making a difference in someone's life. And in many ways you are. But what often goes unnoticed is the lack of balance. The exchange isn't equal. One person is giving energy, attention, and insight. The other is consuming it. Now, in a healthy dynamic, this imbalance would correct itself over time. There would be a shift toward mutuality. The other person would develop awareness, take responsibility, and begin to contribute emotionally in return. But in unhealthy dynamics, the opposite happens. The more you give, the more they take. And the more they take, the more they begin to rely on you not as a person, but as a resource. And that's where something subtle but important occurs. Dependence starts to breed entitlement. What was once appreciated becomes expected. What was once received with gratitude becomes something they feel they deserve. And when you inevitably can't meet that expectation because no one can sustain that level of output indefinitely, the emotional tone changes. This is where resentment begins to form, and it often confuses empaths the most. Because from your perspective, nothing negative was introduced. You were supportive, you were patient, you were present. So when the other person becomes distant, critical, or even hostile, it feels disproportionate. It feels like a shift that came out of nowhere, but it didn't. It came from a psychological imbalance that had been building over time. The other person didn't just value what you gave, they began to measure themselves against it. And that comparison is uncomfortable because your ability to process emotions, to remain stable, to offer clarity, it highlights a gap in their own capacity. And instead of using that awareness as motivation to grow, many people respond by reframing the situation. They start to see your strength not as something admirable, but as something threatening. Your consistency becomes too much. Your insight becomes overanalyzing. Your emotional depth becomes intensity. These labels aren't accurate, they're defensive. They're a way of reducing the discomfort that comes from recognizing something in you that they don't yet possess in themselves. And when that discomfort isn't addressed internally, it gets redirected externally toward you. So now, the very qualities that attracted them in the beginning become the source of irritation. Not because those qualities changed, but because their relationship to those qualities did. What once felt supportive now feels exposing. What once felt grounding now feels confronting. And here's the part that requires a level of clarity most empaths are not initially comfortable with. Some people are not drawn to you because they value who you are. They are drawn to you because they value what you provide. There's a functional difference between being appreciated and being used, and it often reveals itself only over time. This doesn't mean that every person who enters your life has harmful intentions. In many cases, it's unconscious. People operate from patterns they don't fully understand. They seek relief where they can find it, and when they encounter someone who can offer emotional clarity, they attach to it. But unconscious behavior still has consequences. And if you're not aware of the pattern, you can spend a significant amount of time overextending yourself, trying to maintain a dynamic that was never designed to be sustainable. You give more, hoping it will restore balance. You explain more, hoping it will create understanding. But the underlying structure doesn't change because it was built on extraction, not exchange. So the question becomes, what do you do with that awareness? First, you stop interpreting constant need as deep connection. They are not the same. Depth is measured by mutual investment, not by how much someone relies on you. Second, you begin to observe how people respond when access is limited, not removed completely, just limited. Do they become more respectful, more self-aware? Or do they become frustrated, distant, or dismissive? That response tells you everything you need to know about the nature of the dynamic. And finally, you recalibrate your role. You are not responsible for regulating other people's emotional states. You are not obligated to be the constant source of clarity in someone else's confusion. Your ability to understand others is a strength, but it's not a resource that should be available without boundaries. Because when giving becomes your identity, you attract those who are looking to take. And if you don't define the limits of that exchange, someone else will. So the goal is not to stop being empathetic. It's to become precise with it, to recognize where it's valued, where it's respected, and where it's simply consumed. Because the moment you confuse being needed with being respected, you enter a dynamic where your value is no longer defined by who you are, but by how much of yourself you're willing to give away. And that's not connection, that's depletion. There's a moment that almost every empath encounters, and it tends to arrive quietly at first. It's not dramatic, it's not announced. It begins as a subtle internal shift of realization that something about the way you've been engaging with people is no longer sustainable. You start to notice the imbalance more clearly. You feel the weight of constant availability. You recognize that your willingness to understand others has not always been matched by their willingness to understand you. And from that awareness, something begins to change. You start setting boundaries, not as a form of punishment, and not as a reaction of anger, but as a form of clarity. You begin to say no where you used to say yes. You pause where you used to immediately respond. You question dynamics that you previously accepted without hesitation. And most importantly, you stop overextending yourself in situations where your energy is not being respected. From your perspective, this shift feels grounded. It feels necessary. It feels like a correction. But from the perspective of someone who benefited from your lack of boundaries, it feels like something entirely different. It feels like loss. And loss, especially when it's not understood, often translates into resistance. This is where the psychological tension becomes very clear, because boundaries don't just limit behavior, they redefine relationships. They change the terms of engagement. They introduce structure where there was once open access. And for someone who has grown accustomed to that access, the introduction of limits can feel abrupt, even if it's objectively reasonable. Now, here's the critical detail. People don't react to boundaries based on what the boundary actually is. They react based on what the boundary takes away from them. If someone was used to having unrestricted emotional access to you, your time, your attention, your patience, then even a small boundary can feel significant. Not because it's unfair, but because it disrupts a pattern they had come to rely on. And when that pattern is disrupted, it forces them to adjust. But not everyone adjusts by becoming more aware. Some adjust by becoming defensive. They begin to reinterpret your behavior. What used to be seen as kindness is now framed as inconsistency. What used to be appreciated is now questioned. You may hear things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the same anymore," or even more subtle variations that imply distance or detachment. And in a literal sense, they're right. You have changed, but not in the way they're suggesting. You haven't become colder. You've become more precise. You haven't withdrawn your care. You've redefined how it's expressed. You haven't become less empathetic. You've become more discerning about where that empathy is directed. The problem is that distinction is not always recognized by the other person, because from their perspective, the change is measured by access. And when access decreases, it's interpreted as rejection. This is where insecurity begins to surface, because boundaries don't just limit interaction, they introduce accountability. They require the other person to take a more active role in managing their own emotions, their own expectations, and their own behavior. And for someone who is not accustomed to that level of responsibility, it can feel uncomfortable. So instead of adapting internally, they attempt to restore the previous dynamic externally. They push against the boundary. Sometimes it's direct. They question it, challenge it, or try to negotiate around it. Other times it's indirect. They test it subtly, seeing if you'll revert back to old patterns under pressure. And in some cases, when those approaches don't work, the response becomes emotional. Frustration turns into criticism, discomfort turns into distance, and your clarity becomes the target. This is where many empaths experience a kind of internal conflict, because you can feel the shift in the other person. You can sense the tension, the resistance, the change in tone. And there's a part of you that wants to restore harmony, to explain more, to soften the boundary, to make the situation feel comfortable again. But that instinct, while understandable, comes with a cost. Because every time you compromise a boundary to preserve someone else's comfort, you reinforce a dynamic where your needs are secondary. You send a signal both to them and to yourself that your limits are flexible under pressure. And once that pattern is established, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain any form of consistency. So the real challenge is not setting the boundary, it's holding it. And holding it requires a different kind of strength than most people expect. It's not loud, it's not aggressive. It's quiet. It's consistent. It's the ability to tolerate someone else's discomfort without immediately trying to resolve it. It's the willingness to let them have their reaction without taking responsibility for it. That's where the shift happens. Because when you stop managing how others feel about your boundaries, you start allowing the true nature of the relationship to reveal itself. People who respect you will adjust. They may not like the change immediately, but they will recognize its validity. They will meet you with a level of understanding that reflects their own internal stability. But people who were primarily benefiting from your lack of boundaries will struggle, not because the boundary is unreasonable, but because it removes something they were not prepared to lose. And in that struggle, their behavior becomes more transparent. The frustration, the resentment, the subtle attempts to regain control, it all becomes visible. And that visibility is not a problem. It's information. It tells you who was connected to you and who was connected to your availability. And once you see that clearly, your decisions become more grounded. You stop trying to maintain every relationship at the same level. You stop over-explaining your limits. You stop negotiating your own well-being in order to preserve dynamics that were never balanced to begin with. Because boundaries are not about creating distance. They're about defining where you end and someone else begins. And the people who are unsettled by that definition are often the ones who are benefiting from its absence. So if there's one thing to understand here, it's this. When your boundaries trigger someone, they're not reacting to your limits there, reacting to the loss of control those limits create. And that reaction is not a sign that you've done something wrong. It's a sign that you've finally done something right. Because the moment your no starts to disrupt someone else's expectations is the moment you stop living according to them. And that's where real self-respect begins. There's a final layer to this dynamic that doesn't become visible until you've already started to change. It's not about what you give, and it's not even about the boundaries you set. It's about what happens when you begin to grow internally, quietly, and in ways that fundamentally shift how you see yourself and the world around you. Because growth, in its most honest form, is disruptive. Not outwardly, not in a way that demands attention, but internally. It changes your standards. It alters your tolerance. It recalibrates what feels aligned and what doesn't. And for an empath, this kind of growth is often the result of accumulated experience. You've seen enough patterns. You've felt enough imbalance. You've reached a point where awareness is no longer optional, it's integrated. And once that integration happens, you don't relate to people the same way anymore. You become more selective, not out of judgment, but out of clarity. You listen differently. You respond differently. You no longer feel the same urgency to fix, to explain, or to carry emotional weight that doesn't belong to you. There's a shift from participation to observation, from reaction to intention. From the inside, this feels like alignment. But from the outside, especially for those who have not undergone a similar process, it can feel like distance. And this is where the tension begins to deepen. because your growth doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in contrast. It highlights differences in awareness, in responsibility, in emotional maturity. And for someone who has remained in the same patterns, that contrast can be difficult to ignore. It introduces a kind of silent comparison, not one that you initiate and not one that you necessarily even acknowledge, but one that they feel. They notice the shift in your behavior. They recognize that you're no longer engaging in the same ways. The conversations are different. The energy is different. The access is different. And whether they articulate it or not, they begin to measure that difference. Now, for someone who is open to growth, this can be motivating. It can serve as a point of reflection. They may begin to ask themselves questions. They may feel inspired to evolve, to close that gap, to meet you at a new level of awareness. But not everyone responds that way. For some, that contrast doesn't inspire, it threatens, because growth requires confrontation. It requires acknowledging what hasn't been addressed, what hasn't been resolved, what hasn't been developed. And for someone who is not ready to engage in that process, your evolution becomes a reminder of their stagnation. And reminders, especially the ones we didn't choose, tend to create resistance. So instead of moving toward growth, they move into reinterpretation. They start to reframe your change in a way that protects their current position. You're seen as distant, detached, maybe even arrogant. Your calm becomes indifference. Your clarity becomes rigidity. Your silence becomes judgment. These interpretations are not objective, they're defensive. They allow the other person to maintain their current identity without having to confront the discomfort of change. Because if your growth can be labeled as something negative, then it no longer needs to be understood. It can simply be dismissed. And this is where resentment begins to take on a more defined shape. It's no longer just about what you represent, it's about what your growth implies. It implies that change is possible. It implies that patterns can be broken. It implies that the limitations they've accepted may not be fixed. And that implication for someone who has chosen not to change can feel like pressure. Not because you're applying it, but because your existence contradicts their narrative. You become a living example of an alternative path, one that requires effort, honesty, and accountability. And when someone is not prepared to take that path, they often respond by rejecting it. Not directly, not always consciously, but through subtle shifts in behavior. A lack of support, a withdrawal of enthusiasm, a tone that carries just enough distance to be felt but not easily addressed. From your perspective, this can be confusing at first, because your growth was not an attempt to separate, it was an attempt to align. You weren't trying to create distance, you were trying to become more grounded, more stable, more authentic. But growth has a natural consequence. It changes the structure of your relationships. And not all relationships are built to evolve. Some are built on shared patterns, shared habits, shared levels of awareness. And when one person moves beyond that shared space, the connection either adapts or it dissolves. That's not failure, that's reality. The mistake many empaths make at this stage is trying to maintain the old connection while living in a new version of themselves. They attempt to bridge the gap by over-explaining, by minimizing their growth, by revisiting behaviors they've already outgrown. But that creates internal conflict, because you can't move forward while consistently stepping back to maintain what no longer fits. Growth requires a level of consistency. It requires you to honor the changes you've made, even when they create discomfort in your environment. And that's where a different kind of strength is required. Not the strength to endure, but the strength to accept. To accept that not everyone will grow with you. To accept that some people will interpret your evolution through the lens of their own limitations. To accept that being understood is not always a prerequisite for being aligned. Because once you reach a certain level of awareness, your responsibility shifts. It's no longer about being perceived correctly by everyone around you. It's about living in a way that is internally consistent, even if that consistency creates external friction. And when you can hold that position without resentment of your own, something changes. You stop seeing their reaction as a personal rejection. You start seeing it as a reflection of where they are. And that perspective allows you to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight, without trying to fix what isn't yours to fix, without shrinking to preserve connections that require you to be less than what you've become. Because growth is not just about becoming more, it's about becoming more honest. And honesty, when fully lived, has a way of separating what is aligned from what is not. So if there's something to take from this, it's this. Your growth will not always be celebrated by those who benefit from your previous version. And that's not a reason to slow down. It's a reason to keep going. Because the moment you start questioning your evolution to maintain someone else's comfort is the moment you begin to abandon the very progress. That made you stronger. And the cost of that is far greater than any distance growth might create.